So welcome to the node.js Technical Steering Committee meeting for August 30th, 2023. We'll follow our standard approach of going through the agenda in the issue, which was tagged in the repo. That was issue number 1431. But before we get started, does anybody have any news they'd like to share? Okay, so no announcements. We'll move on. I don't think we have any updates from the board meeting or the CPC. So let's move on to the issues that were tagged for the agenda. So the first one is URL does not match the web, does not allow changing protocol from about. This is number 49319. If anybody was the one who tagged that, feel free to jump in.
Yes, so I added that. So the main issue is with this issue is that what WG URL specification states that if you have a URL object and if you want to change the protocol of it, let's say you have a file URL, and if you want to change the file URL protocol from file to HTTP, it doesn't allow you to do that because technically it requires parsing the whole URL from scratch and determine if it's valid or not, because file and HTTP, like special schemes, are special cases. But the thing is, even though this is in what WG standard, no browsers currently support this. And because of that, this is one of the main issues that I added it, but also because there are other certain edge cases that some of the browsers support, but some of them don't, such as opaque origin URLs, which is if you have a non-special scheme URL, which is like git :/anonrig.com. If you go to Google, then it parses it as all of the values after the scheme -- part is parsed in path name. But in Safari, it's parsed correctly in the host and so on and so forth. So when there was a discussion between a couple of developers in the issue, and when I looked into the documentation, it said that the WetVG URL API, browser compatible URL class implemented by following the WetVG URL standard. So this specific wording is the main reason that I added this, because we are a spec compliant. We have a spec compliant URL parser, but this wording of browser compatible URL class is causing friction and issues, saying that the title of the issue also explains it. So I wanted to ask for the TSC consensus about whether we are strictly following the URL specification, which is what we are doing right now. And I also wanted to get a consensus about removing the browser compatible keyword from the documentation and saying that we are following WetVG URL standard. So, yeah.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
I think the spec is only useful for the purpose of compatibility. Like, I think that the reason we say that in the docs is because we assume that everyone else is following the spec. If they're not, then it doesn't help if we do so. I think what users care about is that code runs the same way in multiple places. No one cares if those multiple places all follow the spec or all diverge from the spec in the same way. That's of little concern to users. So I think what's most important is just that we have to be compatible. That doesn't mean that we have to immediately switch to do what browsers are doing. They might be unaware that they're violating the spec, and or the spec may change to match them. So I think we need to open those conversations both with WhatWG to be like, and with browsers, probably through WhatWG, to be like, hey, is this just a mistake? Well, it's probably a mistake on one side or the other. Either the spec is wrong or the browsers are wrong. So who's going to change? I would guess the spec will change because that's not going to break anyone, whereas the browsers changing will only do so if their divergence was unintentional and or a bug. But we kind of just need to see what they say. And if, I mean, there should be no question for us to decide, is what I'm getting at. Like, these should converge one way or the other. Either the spec will be updated to match the browsers, or the browsers will be like, oh, our bad, we didn't realize, and then the browsers will update to match the spec. Then they'll be in conformance again, and if the spec changes, then we'll need to change. But, you know, then it'll be fine. You know, the worst case scenario is the spec people are like, yeah, the spec's right, those browsers need to change, and the browser people are like, no, we're right, the spec should change, and like they each hold their ground, and then we kind of have to choose between them. But ultimately, like, if the browsers are clear that like they're going to do it this way no matter what the spec says, then we have to do the same for another to avoid being incompatible. But I don't think we should make any changes until we know that. Like, until we know which way people intend to go, like, we just have to sit and wait until that is answered. But I don't think it's likely that the divergence is gonna, like, they're gonna come, one side or the other is gonna change, and then we'll be fine and we won't need to worry about it.
Tobias, you had your hand up next.
Yeah, I agree that we should just raise the issue with WhatWG and let them make the decision essentially, or let browsers give input. I don't think I do think that it's preferable to follow the spec over what browsers do, because browsers are not consistent. One browser is going to do one thing, the other. We do have URL issues where Node matches Safari, for example, but not Chrome or Firefox. So I don't want this to become a case-by-case thing where every time we have a deviation from the spec, we have to see what every single other runtime does. And then we have to see, okay, do we follow Chrome or do we follow literally every other runtime? So if we just say we follow the spec, then we can justify our decision very easily without having to decide for every single case what browser we follow. So yeah, I agree. Let's raise it to the WhatWG and let's not base the decision simply based off of what browsers do.
Yeah, I think sorry, I guess you had your name up next, your hand up next.
Just a quick note. So because I'm wearing two different hats in this particular issue, one of them is being on the implementer side, and one of them is being a TSC member. It's as an implementer, it's obvious that whenever an issue similar to this raised, then I will automatically, on Ada URL side, I will automatically close it and say that you need to reach to the WhatWG URL and create an issue there, and whatever changes happens there, then we need to implement it in Ada. And because we are following each of the WhatWG changes by 24 to 48 hour difference, these kind of issues arise. And like one of the wording that like both of you said, that we need to raise this issue towards WhatWG, but I respectfully disagree, because I don't think we need to do anything about it, because this is a problem that's eventually going to solve with the Interop 2023, what browsers are doing. But whenever something similar issue opens, it's every time people assume that it's Node.js is causing this issue, and Node.js is the main reason about this. And I think that changing the documentation and stating that we are at WhatWG compliant 1 is a step towards making like about saying that this is the approach that we are taking. I'm fine with doing something else, but the documentation right now, it's creating ambiguity, and because of that, people are claiming that we need to be web compatible, but we are a WhatWG compatible URL parser. So that was the consensus that I was trying to seek.
I think like my take would be, it's kind of I think we may be saying similar things, right? Like, I don't think we'd hold out for like, hey, the spec says this, but everybody does something different. But I could see, and I think it was maybe Tobias who was like, well, we start out with like, we follow the spec, right? And that's like our first principle is we follow the spec, then, but you know, if it's clear that nobody else follows the spec, you know, then web compatibility is where we go to, right? Like if all the other browsers do something different and they're all the same, then we would fall back to that. You know, that kind of seems like a general principle that we could stick to, right? And
yeah, so in terms of URL specification conformance, the original author of URL standard works at Apple and also writes and updates the URL specification. On Chrome has its own URL parser. On Firefox uses servo URL, which doesn't follow the URL specification up to date, and it has around 20 failing tests. So basically, in terms of implementer phase, Ada right now is the only URL parser that follows the spec 100%. And it has more test coverage than web platform tests. And because of that, I feel like we are getting punished because we are following it 100%. And if we look at case-by-case basis, it's nearly impossible to remove a certain feature or re-edit again, because all of them is a breaking change. And if you change one thing, it has a side effect that's really hard to understand because the URL specification is extremely intercoupled with each other. So yeah, these are my personal opinions about it. So if everyone is okay with it, I recommend updating the documentation. I can open a PR and open tag TST regarding it.
now, is this documentation for the parser or for like in general?
Node.js URL documentation in the website. I can just share the link.
I mean, you can open the PR, but I'm not sure I agree that like we just say we follow the spec, because yeah, if there's a clear, I you know, to Michael's point that like if everyone else breaks the spec in the same way and they're aware of it and they say they do not intend to conform to the spec, then we're gonna have to follow the crowd.
Why wouldn't
that should never happen. I don't think that's likely to happen. So maybe that's not worth like leaving it out for in the doc, but you know, it's already happening here, you know, but I don't know.
It's a living standard, and if every other runtime deviates from it, why wouldn't the standard be adapted? I think
I would think it would. I would guess. You know,
exactly. So I think Benjamin was right in the issue when he said the TSC is going to discuss it for 2 minutes and then say let's let the WG handle it. I don't think there's much we can decide here.
But I think we could agree that if the browsers do different things and the spec says something different, we should likely be doing what's in the spec.
I 100% agree Michael's statement, because the browsers are the one that founded WebWG and they're the ones that doesn't follow it. So there's a extremely, I don't know the correct word here, but
I'm just kind of like I totally get the part, like if everybody else, like all the browsers do something, then I think we are motivated by compatibility. So we might choose to do that. But like if Firefox does one thing and Chrome does another thing, and you know, how do we even choose, right? So we should just stick with the spec in that case.
yes. Even right now, if we say that, okay, changing the protocol of a file is supported, what happens if Safari adds it? Then are we going to re-edit in the Ada itself? And following what other browsers implement is like, we need to track of these changes, and it's extremely hard as an implementer. So that's why I'm trying to push towards WebWG compatible URL class instead of browser compatible URL class implemented by the WebWG standard wording that the documentation uses.
It sounds like opening the PR might make sense, but there might also be some more discussion when you do that, right? Like to wordsmith what people are happy with.
I think it's, sorry, Michael.
No, go ahead.
I think it's fine to say that it's browser compatible because it is the only browser compatible API for URLs in Node.js, and it might deviate from browser behavior in like one or two minor aspects. But I think if those were huge problems, we would have seen way more issues about that. So for 99.9% of use cases, it is compatible with browsers.
Yes, but also the URL specification changes a lot. Not a lot. Every 1-2 months, there is a one different change, and we follow them exactly at a really fast pace. But the other browsers and big companies doesn't, and we are eventually going to deviate because they're having a hard time following up with those changes, and we don't.
I think you can open the PR about the docs if you want to, but I don't think there's anything that really needs to be done right now. Like, yeah, you're right. It's not on us to complain to WhatWG. It's on whoever is opening the bug with us. And we can just leave it at that, you know, like see what happens with WhatWG and go from there. And the people who care about this can report back to us. You know, I don't think we need to do anything. We don't even need to update our docs.
Okay, anything more we should discuss before we move on to the next issue?
No.
No.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. The next one is ESM at import meta.dirname and import meta.filename. I think Jeffrey, you've been sort of leading the charge on that. Any update or things we should discuss?
About this one. Well, yeah. My proposal to WinterCG is just kind of hanging there. No one, I guess, like from WinterCG wants to review it or approve it. Haven't heard back from Bun. They're launching 1.0 like next week, so I guess they're too busy for this at the moment. I don't know when the next WinterCG meeting is. I think it's in early September. So I have a bad feeling that this might not get resolved then, since they're going to be like, oh, we can't do anything at this without Bun's input, and Bun's unavailable. So then it might kick for a whole nother month. But maybe
Last
that's fine.
time we said,
I don't think this is like so urgent to land. So if we want
Right.
to say it's going to wait another month, we'll have a bunch of angry users on our repo. But yeah, I don't know what else people suggest or want to do.
I'm on the, it's been a long-standing issue, so I don't think we should rush. It would be good to give us like we don't want to wait forever ever either, right? Like, is it, you know, is there a point at which we think we've done enough versus and we should just move ahead? Like, or do you know, maybe we can't even decide that yet, but that would
We
be
could at
the only
least see
thing.
what, yeah, we could see what happens at the September WinterCG meeting. Potentially wait until the October one at the very least. And then maybe at that point we'll be like, okay, we waited long enough, this process isn't going anywhere, and we decide to go ahead on our own. But I mean, unless anyone objects, I would think let's at least wait that long before we fix course. Hopefully we'll be able to get done detention before October. The only issue on my proposal that anyone pointed out was a desire to standardize forward slashes or backslashes in task strings, like for Windows. I don't really feel confident being able to write that language. So if anyone knows about that and feels comfortable adding some, like making the PR or suggestion on my proposal to add that, I would appreciate it. Or I can ask on our GitHub issue if anyone feels expert enough to do that.
Maybe
But
it
that's
would
the
be
only
worthwhile
addition.
at mentioning platform windows.
Okay.
See if that gets anybody from the people who've shown interest on the Windows side to, they can, could say, hey, I could use help for this.
I don't think you, I might be mistaken, but if I remember correctly, you can't mention teams across organizations.
I could mention it in the PR that like this got spawned from. Because then I should be able to mention the node group from there.
Right. Yeah, that
Oh,
might be.
and the other thing is on that PR, we asked for a benchmark and James added one. I don't really know how to interpret it. So if anyone feels confident looking into the results of that, because basically like it was sort of like, we're going to be creating these new properties on every module that gets loaded. Obviously, they're not used for the vast majority of them. So, does it make sense to make this as a getter? Does even making it as a getter cause a performance hit? I just wanted someone to look into that. And, James says that it's negligible, not noticeable performance hit, which would be great. But, if it is if he's wrong somehow, then that would be a something strong to consider, that these are just convenience methods and we don't want to like slow down all apps for them if it's noticeable.
Regarding Windows CG, I agree it makes sense to wait a bit longer. On the other hand, I believe that Dino has a pretty strong opinion, and I wouldn't be surprised if they don't change that. They have very good arguments objectively. And one sounds like they would converge with Node on this, and I assume the other runtimes simply don't care because Cloudflare Workers is not going to add like file paths or so, or since it's not a physical file or anything. So I guess it really comes down to Dino's opinion versus Buns and Node's opinion. And Dino has good arguments, so I wouldn't expect them to change that regardless of how good your PR is.
It's more a question of whether they're okay with it. Like the proposal is just that this is an optional thing that runtimes can add, not that they should add it or need to add it.
Right.
So
okay. So
more
sorry to
if they're
interrupt you.
okay with that.
In the worst case, we would just try to converge with Bun and not with Dino.
Well, and have Dino not block it. I mean, ideally, it's sort of like I would love to get their input in the sense that like if they want to add it at some point, this is the spec that they would follow. Like, if you guys change your mind and decide you want to add this sometime down the line, is this the spec that you would want to add?
Right.
But yeah, that's all I'm kind of hoping to get from them.
Okay, I'm wondering if we should take it off the TSC agenda if we're just waiting until that happens, or do you want to leave it on as a reminder so we don't forget?
I don't know. Up to you. We can take it off.
It's if we're basically just waiting, maybe it makes sense to take it off and then like you can add it back on.
Maybe leave it on for one more week because I think the winter CG meeting is next week. I don't know when I think it's like early September. So we should discuss this again after that winter CG meeting, which may or may not be before the very next CSC meeting, but then it can go off. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, we'll do that. It's next week on Thursday,
Is the winter
which is
CG
after
meeting?
the TSC meeting, but
Okay, well then you can take it off. That's fine.
okay, I will just and so basically, as soon as there's something like if the meeting happens or whatever, just put it back on and then it'll show up on the agenda.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, sounds good. The next one is additions to import.meta. So this was the sort of separate question of whether we think it's Semver major, Semver minor. Again, I know, Jeffrey, you've been looking at that. Anything we should discuss or just this conversation
I
moving
feel like
on there?
I feel like we're missing the people who we need to be here. Like I think James is the one who was arguing that it should be Semver major. I think everyone on that thread that I opened seems to think it should be Semver minor. Maybe we could just postpone this until we have a bigger crowd. I don't know.
Okay. Okay, just taking a note to say, let's leave on the agenda to discuss a large group. The next one, collaborator meeting before the next node conf EU, I took that off. I took off the TSC agenda. Probably should have done that after last time. I think we agreed there isn't going to be anything outside of the conference itself. There may be some workshop time or something like that, but that was the main question. So I took that off unless anybody else has any thoughts or thinks we should have some discussion on that one. Okay, the next one is nominations for OpenJS CPC voting members. That one is an FYI in terms of, we're re-electing our voting members. Sounds like our existing members of Joe and Rich are happy to serve again, but again, they're also happy to have somebody else. So, I would say the time is coming that, if you're interested at all, volunteer. Probably in the next day or so. Otherwise, I think the assumption will be that, the existing members will be proposed again. Similarly, I took off the redesign of the Node.js website because that was put on very specifically last week for an update that we had Claudio join us for. So I don't think there's anything to discuss. Unless somebody has something they'd want to bring up. Okay, and then the last thing on the agenda was expose WebSocket in Node bundle. This is 2217. I think last time, if I remember, we said we wanted to discuss when Matteo was here, but I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts or things we should discuss on that.
I mean, I'd rather not keep this getting blocked week after week because we're waiting on Matteo. I don't think that anyone's objecting to it, and this PR, I think, doesn't expose the new API to the public just yet. It's just exposing it to internal code for now. So it seems pretty low risk, but it seems like we have consensus to add a WebSocket client like we added Fetch. Although that's a much bigger project, but no one seemed opposed to that, in principle. So I think unless anyone objects, I feel like let's give the go ahead if someone wants to start working on that, that they'll know that the CSC is generally supportive and they should start investing the time into that.
I mean, we don't have enough people yet to make any decision, but nobody's objecting to the PR. So I don't know the Onichi collaborator guide, but I assume they can just merge the PR if they want to.
Yeah, but I think it's a big enough effort, similar to Fetch, that I don't, I feel like if we can send some kind of message, yeah, there's only 6 of us here, but we could also talk on the CSC Slack, see does anyone object to this? If not, let's send some message, just drop a note on that issue or PR, whatever it was, that, yeah, that CSC approves adding a global WebSocket to be a WebSocket client compatible with browsers, compatible with Dino. Essentially go for it. And then that might motivate someone to put in the effort to make the PR.
Yeah, I think like Tobias, we just need to have enough people either in a meeting where we could say 10 of the 20 were here, or if somebody wants to collect the non-objection / agreements in some other way, that would work too. So let's leave on for, I think I'd say let's leave on for another week until either that happens, or maybe we have a big enough group next time that could, we can say from the group that we had, there's probably there's enough mass to be able to say something. Make sense? Okay, that takes us to the end of the regular issues, and I did want to spend a little bit of time in a private session, so I'd suggest we jump over to that private session unless anybody has any particular other topics we should just cover before we do that. Okay, well, thanks for everybody who's attended and those watching on the live stream. I'm